They called her quiet. They called her the new girl. They called her invisible. What they didn't know was that the woman in scrubs moving through Oak Creek Memorial Surgical Ward at 6:19 a.m. on a Tuesday had spent 12 years keeping people alive in places where the difference between breathing and bleeding out was measured in seconds. They didn't know that her hands, steady, precise, scarred along the knuckles from shrapnel she'd never had properly treated, had held more lives together than most trauma surgeons would see in a career. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had walked into voluntary anonymity, traded Baghdad for Raleigh, and chosen a name no one would recognize and a job no one would question. The hospital didn't know what was walking through its corridors. Neither did the man who would decide her fate before the week was over. Oak Creek Memorial smells like antiseptic and floor wax, that particular combination that lives in the walls of every hospital in America. The fluorescent lights hum at exactly 60 Hz, a frequency that Danielle had learned to filter out years ago the same way she'd learned to filter out the sound of mortars. She moves through the surgical ward with efficient silence, her scrubs hiding a slight limp in her left leg, a permanent reminder of a roadside IED outside Fallujah that had killed 2 of her team members. The limp is barely noticeable if you're not looking for it. Most people aren't. Her badge, simple, institutional, reading Danielle Ross, RN, catches the light as she reaches for a patient's full line. She completes the complex setup in 40 seconds while other nurses struggle with the port, her muscle memory overriding any hesitation. The needle goes in at precisely the right angle. The line flushes clean. Move to the next patient. Move to the next task. Never draw attention. Never ask for help. Never let anyone see the combat medic underneath the scrubs. In her locker, tucked against the back wall beneath a spare pair of compression socks, sits a faded unit patch from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The patch is worn soft from 3 tours and sewn into the jacket lining of the one piece of her old life she couldn't bring herself to discard. She touches it sometimes, before her shift, the way other people touch crucifixes or photographs. The silk feels like memory. The embroidered eagle feels like a name she no longer says aloud. Her sister knows she's a nurse. Her sister doesn't know where. Not even her therapist, Dr. Carver, who meets with her every other Thursday in a basement office that smells like chamomile tea and clinical detachment, knows the full truth. Danielle has learned that some secrets are smaller when kept close to the chest. The morning rounds begin at 7 o'clock sharp. Dr. Sterling sweeps into the surgical wing with the kind of confident stride that tells you everything you need to know about a man that has never had to earn respect, only demand it. He's tall, expensive-looking in the way that wealth codes itself into posture, with a Rolex that catches the light just often enough to remind the staff that he's watching. He scans the nurse's station the way a predator scans a watering hole, looking for weakness, hierarchy violations, anyone stepping out of the carefully constructed order that keeps him at the center of everything. Danielle watches him without appearing to watch him. She's learned this too, the civilian equivalent of tactical awareness, staying in the background while remaining completely alert. Dr. Sterling stops at a patient's chart. His eyes move across the room, cataloging, assessing. He lands on Danielle and his expression shifts. She doesn't look up from the foredrip she's adjusting, but she feels the weight of his attention the way you feel pressure change before a storm. It's not an accidental noticing. It's recognition of something that doesn't fit. She moves with the kind of precision that makes senior residents nervous. She speaks only when necessary, and only to communicate critical information. She doesn't laugh at his jokes during rounds. She doesn't seem impressed by his credentials or his position or the way other nurses scramble to anticipate his needs before he asks for them. To Dr. Sterling, this represents a problem. What he sees is a competent nurse. What he doesn't see, what he can't possibly understand, is that her competence comes from a place he's never inhabited. She's not trying to be impressive. She's trying to be invisible. The fact that competence makes invisibility impossible is a problem he will decide, very soon, to solve. An emergency comes through at 8:15 a.m. A 42-year-old male, appendicitis, complications, needs surgery now. The surgical team moves like a practiced machine, everyone knowing their place, everyone understanding the hierarchy. Danielle is assigned to assist. She moves to the instrument table and her hands shift into a rhythm that's been encoded into her nervous system by thousands of repetitions in operating theaters on 3 continents. The appendectomy is straightforward until it isn't. There's infection spreading beyond the appendix. The surgeon calls for sutures. Danielle anticipates the exact moment he'll need them and has them ready at 2 cubic centimeters with the needle at precisely the angle he prefers, even though she's never worked with this surgeon before. The speed with which she moves, the way her hands seem to know things before instruction, the field-expedient efficiency of her technique, it creates a moment of perfect clarity in the operating theater. Everything pauses. The surgeon looks at his hands, looks at the sutures, looks at the nurse who just anticipated his needs with the kind of precision that takes years to develop. He says nothing. He doesn't have to. But another pair of eyes is watching. The patient, a man named Marcus Webb, 51 years old, former Army combat medic, 3 tours, the kind of medical training that comes from keeping people alive in field conditions, notices something the surgeon doesn't. After his appendix is out and the infection is being cleaned, when Danielle moves to repair the surgical site, she uses a technique that shouldn't exist in a civilian hospital. It's too efficient. It's too practiced. It's the kind of muscle memory that comes from stitching wounds in convoy trucks while rounds impact the vehicle around you. Marcus Webb watches her hands move and something registers in his brain like a password being entered. He's seen this before. He's done this before. He whispers it while she's working, his voice soft but clear in the anesthetized silence. You served. Danielle doesn't pause. Her hands don't shake. Her focus doesn't waver. The suture goes in. The line is perfect. She steps back from the surgical table without meeting his eyes and walks away before he can ask the follow-up question. The OR doors close behind her. She moves into the hallway where the light is fluorescent and artificial and nobody is asking her anything about Baghdad or combat or the reason her muscle memory knows how to do things that civilian nurses simply don't do. Marcus Webb doesn't press the issue. He's a medic. He understands the code. Some people don't want to be recognized. Some people aren't running toward their past, they're running away from it. You don't follow them. You let them disappear. Danielle finishes her shift at 3 o'clock. She clocks out, changes back into street clothes in the locker room, and touches the unit patch one more time before closing the metal door. The drive home takes 17 minutes on I-40 heading west toward Ghana. She has a small apartment, nothing distinctive, nothing that suggests she's anyone other than a nurse named Danielle Ross who keeps to herself and doesn't attend the hospital happy hours. There are no photographs on her walls. No decorations. No evidence of the life she lived before this one. There's a photograph in a drawer, her and her husband, Marcus, taken 6 years ago before the IED that killed him and changed the trajectory of everything, but she doesn't look at it often. Some things are too heavy to carry in plain sight. What Danielle doesn't know, as she drives home through Raleigh traffic, is that Dr. Sterling has already begun making calls. What she doesn't know is that her competence has registered not as a strength but as a threat. What she doesn't know is that a man who has spent his entire career climbing the hierarchy through manipulation and favoritism sees her efficiency, her silence, her refusal to engage in the social dynamics of the hospital, as a challenge to his authority. He's already considering how to address it. He's already thinking about the kind of pressure that can be applied to someone who doesn't have a support network, who has no allies in the hospital, who is too new to have developed the kind of professional alliances that protect people in institutional settings. The phone calls will start tomorrow. The setup will take time. But the decision has already been made. Danielle doesn't know this yet. Tonight she'll heat up leftover rice and chicken. She'll watch the rain that's starting to fall against her apartment windows. She'll do the breathing exercises her therapist taught her, for counts in, hold for 4, for counts out, to manage the way anxiety tightens her chest sometimes without warning. She'll touch the unit patch one more time and remember the faces of people she couldn't save, which is a memory she carries every single day and has never told anyone about. She'll sleep for 6 hours, wake up at 4:51 a.m. the way her body has been trained to do, and go back to Oak Creek Memorial at 6:02 a.m. the next morning, moving through the halls with the same quiet efficiency, the same invisible competence, the same determination to be nobody special. But the moment she turned attention pneumothorax patient from dead to breathing, the moment Dr. Sterling decided her existence was an inconvenience, everything changed. She just doesn't know it yet. Sterling made the announcement on Danielle's third day at Oak Creek Memorial, and he chose his moment with the precision of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of public humiliation. The nurses' station was crowded, surgical team gathered around charts, residents waiting for rounds to begin, the kind of audience that amplified every word into something that echoed. He approached her while she was updating a patient file, voice pitched just loud enough for the entire floor to hear. "Nurse Ross, I want to make you a deal." He leaned against the counter with the ease of a man accustomed to being listened to. His residents turned. 2 nursing supervisors paused mid-conversation. "You quit within 7 days, and I'll write you a reference. A good one. You stay, and I promise you, I'll make sure you regret wasting everyone's time here." His residents snickered. The sound hung in the air like cigarette smoke, toxic, lingering, impossible to ignore. Danielle took one measured breath. She kept her eyes on the chart in front of her, let the moment stretch exactly as long as it needed to. Then she looked up. Her gaze met his, steady and unblinking, the kind of eye contact that made men uncomfortable because it contained no fear, no anger, no reaction at all. Just observation. She said nothing. Turned back to her charting. Let the silence speak for her. Sterling's smile tightened. He didn't like being ignored. Men who built their power on public performance never did. 2 days later, the cafeteria at Oak Creek Memorial was crowded at lunch, nurses rotating through meals between shifts, orderlies grabbing quick calories, the fluorescent lights humming their endless mechanical song above stainless steel tables. Danielle sat alone in the corner, a habit she'd maintained since the first day. A tray in front of her, soup, salad, a roll, water. Simple. Unremarkable. The way she approached everything. Sterling appeared like he'd been waiting for his entrance cue. He reached across the table without speaking, didn't ask permission, didn't hesitate. His hand connected with her tray and knocked it sideways with the casual violence of someone who'd never faced consequences for casual violence. Soup erupted across the tile floor in a wide copper splash. The salad scattered, lettuce and tomatoes exploding outward like shrapnel. The bowl clattered and broke. The sound cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade through silk, and the room shifted. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. His residents, always nearby, always watching for cues about what was acceptable, erupted in laughter. The sound felt manufactured, forced, like applause from people who didn't actually find anything funny but understood that the show was about approval. "Oops," Sterling said, examining his nails with theatrical concern. "Better clean that up, sweetheart." He walked away. His residents trailed him like remoras following a shark. Danielle remained seated for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood, slowly, and retrieved paper towels from the dispenser near the sink. She knelt on the tile floor, careful, deliberate movements, and began picking up each piece. Lettuce. Tomato. Broken ceramic. The water that had spilled was already soaking into her scrubs at the knee, cold against her skin. She worked methodically, gathering the pieces, aware that everyone was still watching. Aware that staff members had suddenly developed intense interest in their phones, their coffee, anywhere but her face. One tear escaped. Just one. It ran down her cheek while her hands continued their work, steady, precise, showing no tremor. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Sterling's departing figure. When she spoke, her voice was pitched low enough that only those standing closest would hear it. When she spoke, it sounded like a tank idling in a garage, all that power held behind the thinnest possible restraint. "I've cleaned up worse messes from better men." Sterling stopped walking. His residents noticed. The laughter died. He turned back, and for a moment his expression cycled through something raw, anger, yes, but underneath it something else. The recognition of someone who'd just been measured and found wanting. He recovered quickly, rearranged his face into its default sneer, and continued toward his office. But his jaw was tighter than before. His movements less fluid. That night, alone in her apartment, Danielle stood under the shower and let the hot water run until her skin reddened. She pressed her forehead against the tile and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to feel the weight of it. The public humiliation. The calculated cruelty. The way Sterling had orchestrated an audience before delivering each blow. In Baghdad, she'd learned to compartmentalize. Pain was information, not the point of the story. But this was different. This was meant to break her in front of witnesses. This was meant to make her quit. She got out of the shower, dried off, and opened her closet. Her work jacket hung among the other clothes, unremarkable, navy blue, nothing special. She reached into the interior pocket and felt the small fabric lump sewn into the lining. The unit patch. Faded from years of wear, from the desert sun and the rain of 3 continents. From hands that had held it during moments when holding something solid was the only thing keeping her alive. She pressed her palm against it for 3 seconds, then released. The next morning, she arrived at Oak Creek Memorial exactly on time. The nurses' station was moderately busy, morning shift transitions, patients being readied for procedures, the controlled chaos that defined hospitals at 7 in the morning. Danielle was organizing patient charts when Sterling entered with the kind of entrance he reserved for moments he'd been rehearsing. He didn't speak. He walked directly to where she was working, reached out, and gathered the entire stack of charts into his arms. Medical records that contained hours of her meticulous documentation. His fingers crumpled the papers as he lifted them. Then he hurled them across the nurse's station. The impact was theatrical and deliberate. Charts exploded through the air like wounded birds. Papers scattered across every surface, the counter, the floor, the desk, hitting walls and floating down in slow motion. Medical records with her handwriting, her documentation, her competence reduced to garbage. His residents materialized. They were always nearby, and one of them actually laughed out loud, the sound harsh and brittle in the sudden silence. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, examining his nails with the kind of casual cruelty that required practice to perfect. "Unless you'd like to reconsider my offer." Danielle didn't move for 2 full seconds. The room held its breath. She could feel every eye in the station tracking her response, waiting to see if this would be the moment she broke. Waiting to see if Sterling's prediction of her departure would finally come true. Then she began picking up the papers. One at a time. Her movements were completely steady. Her hand showed no tremor. She organized them by chart number, then by room number, creating order from chaos with the kind of focus that made her invisible to the onlookers. Because that was what they were watching for: anger, tears, some visible sign of damage. What they got instead was a woman sorting papers like she had nothing but time and infinite patience. Like Sterling was a weather pattern she was simply waiting to pass. One of the nursing supervisors moved to help. Danielle shook her head. No. This was hers to handle. She continued, and as she worked, something shifted in the room. The humiliation reversed direction. Sterling's victory became complicated. He'd thrown the papers, and she'd simply begun picking them up. He'd tried to break her in front of witnesses, and the witnesses were beginning to look at him differently. That evening, Sterling sat in his office on the 3rd floor with the door closed and made 3 phone calls in quick succession. The first was to James Ashford, a board member who'd hired Sterling 3 years ago and owed him for keeping quiet about a billing irregularity. The second was to HR, requesting every document in Danielle's personnel file. The third was to the single reference she'd listed when applying, a retired nursing supervisor in Colorado who, when Sterling's voice came through the line with carefully measured concern about procedural violations and unorthodox techniques, suddenly became very helpful with information about how Danielle might not be as reliable as her resume suggested. By the time he hung up the phone, Sterling had begun building a case. Methodical. Patient. The kind of sabotage that wouldn't look like sabotage to anyone watching. Just an administrator with appropriate concerns about patient safety. Just a doctor trying to protect his hospital from liability. Danielle drove home through rain that hammered the windshield like applause, and even though her hand stayed steady on the wheel, even though she'd maintained her composure through every public cruelty Sterling could manufacture, she understood something that made the silence in her apartment feel heavier than it had before. Staying invisible had never really been possible. All she'd done was delay the moment when her past caught up with her. The ER doors burst open at 3:44 a.m. Gurney incoming. The paramedics were already shouting before the wheels hit the tile. Tension pneumothorax. Training jump gone wrong. The patient, a man in his early 30s with a kind of posture that came from a decade of rucking through hostile terrain, was fighting for breath. His chest heaved wrong. Not synchronized. The right side wasn't moving at all. Danielle was 2 beds away, restocking a crash cart, when she heard the call. She didn't look up. Didn't need to. The oxygen saturation monitor was already singing its warning song, that high-pitched beeping that meant her body was dying in real time. She knew that sound the way some people knew their own heartbeat. The on-call residents, 3 of them, fresh and confident from their morning coffee, converged on the patient like bees around a flower. The attending was somewhere in the hospital. Nobody had called him yet. That was the first mistake. Get a chest tube set up, one resident said, but his voice had the tremor of someone following a protocol instead of reading a patient. The paratrooper's lips were already tinged blue. His oxygen saturation, 88%. Dropping. The monitor beeped faster. 82%. His eyes were wide, aware, terrified in the way only a trained soldier gets terrified, not from fear but from understanding exactly what his body was doing. Dying. Right now. In front of witnesses. 75%. The beeping became a wail. One of the residents fumbled with a chest tube tray. Stainless steel instrument scattered across the bedside table. He hadn't even opened the sterile field. Another resident was still trying to get 2 large bore 4s placed, hands shaking slightly, muttering protocol words that meant nothing when a man's lungs were collapsing into vacuum. 72%. The attending still wasn't coming. Danielle set down the medication bottle she was holding. The plastic made a soft click against the cart. She didn't think. Thinking was the enemy right now. Thinking meant hesitation. Thinking meant watching a trained warrior die because she was afraid of being discovered. Her hands moved on their own. She crossed the ER in for smooth strides. Pulled a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, the kind that looked too small to matter but was precisely, expertly sized for this exact moment. She didn't request permission. Didn't announce herself. The residents didn't even notice her until she was already at the bedside. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. The voice that came from somewhere deeper than civilian nursing. The voice that had given orders in Baghdad when the world was falling apart. One of the residents turned. What are? She was already counting ribs by touch, her fingers moving with the absolute certainty of someone who had done this in darkness, in rain, in the back of a Humvee while incoming fire chewed the metal around her. Her hand found the space. Located the landmark. Prepped the skin with a single alcohol swab in a motion so practiced it was prayer. The needle went in. For one eternal second, nothing. Then the hiss. That distinctive, unmistakable sound of pressurized air escaping from a cavity that should have been sealed. The sound of a life being saved in real time. The oxygen monitor jumped immediately. 74%. 79%. 85%. The patient gasped, actual breath, actual expansion of his right lung as the pressure released and the collapsed tissue could finally reinflate. Danielle stepped back before anyone could ask her name. The resident stared at the needle, at the patient, at the suddenly normalizing vital signs, as if they were witnessing a magic trick performed by someone they didn't know existed. The attending burst through the ER doors 60 seconds later, already in motion, and found the crisis resolved. Chest tube was placed properly within 2 minutes. The paratrooper's oxygen saturation stabilized at 94%. His color returned. His breathing synchronized. Who performed the decompression? The attending asked, looking at the 3 residents. They looked at each other. None of them answered. But Dr. Sterling saw. He was standing in the ER entrance, coffee in hand, watching the controlled chaos resolve into normalcy. His eyes locked on Danielle for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to understand what had just happened. Long enough to see an opportunity crystallize. The attending didn't press the question. The crisis was over. The patient was stable. In the chaos of a teaching hospital, sometimes the exact sequence of events got blurred in the adrenaline and motion. Sometimes people did things outside their defined role because the alternative was unthinkable. Sometimes that got noted later, in a quieter moment. Dr. Sterling had already turned and disappeared down the hallway. Danielle finished restocking the crash cart. Her hands were steady. Her breathing had returned to baseline. To anyone watching, she was just another nurse returning to routine after a late-night emergency. The kind of professional composure that most people mistook for indifference. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Years and years of restraint, compressed into a single moment where she'd let the mast slip just enough to keep someone alive. The paratrooper watched her as she worked. Conscious now, chest rising and falling with proper rhythm, color returned to his face. His eyes followed her movements across the ER. She could feel the weight of his attention the way a prey animal feels a predator's eyes from across a dark field. He knew something. Not everything, not yet, but he knew that the person who had just saved his life was not simply another nurse following a protocol. "You," he called out, his voice still rough from the collapsed lung. "Nurse. What's your name?" Danielle didn't turn around. She placed the last medication bottle into its slot and closed the crash cart drawer with a soft metallic click. She walked toward the other end of the ER, where a different patient needed vitals checked, where the work continued, where invisible people did visible things and disappeared back into the machinery of the hospital. "Hey," the paratrooper called again. "Wait." But she was already gone. 30 minutes later, Danielle was charting in the break room, filling out the mundane documentation that made up 70% of modern nursing, when the overhead intercom crackled. "Nurse Ross. Report to Administrator Hendrick's office. 2nd floor. Now." She didn't hesitate. Didn't consider the possibility that this wasn't good. She simply closed the chart, set down her pen, and stood. Her legs carried her toward the elevator with the same mechanical precision they always did. The office was cold. Antiseptic smell, bleach and old coffee. Danielle had been in this room exactly once before, during her hiring orientation 3 weeks prior. Administrator Hendrick sat behind a desk that cost more than her monthly rent. Dr. Sterling stood to his right, hands clasped in front of him like a man at prayer. Security stood by the door. The whole tableau had the choreography of something that had been planned. "Ms. Ross," Hendricks began, his voice carrying the weight of someone reading from a script. "You performed an invasive medical procedure approximately 30 minutes ago in the emergency department without physician authorization. You performed a needle decompression, a procedure that requires a licensed physician to supervise. The patient was in extremis," Danielle said. Her voice was level. Oxygen saturation was in the 60s. The attending was not immediately available. "That's not the issue," Dr. Sterling interjected. He was smiling. A small, satisfied smile that made the air in the room feel cold. "The issue is protocol. The issue is scope of practice. You are a nurse, Ms. Ross. Not a doctor. That procedure should have been performed by a physician. He would have died in the time it took to wait." "Nevertheless," Sterling's smile widened, "I've already contacted 3 board members. I've reviewed your references from your previous employment. Interestingly, They're quite sparse. Almost non-existent, actually. And I've initiated an investigation into whether this is even the first time you've exceeded your scope of practice. Whether you've been operating outside your license for weeks. Danielle didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He'd already decided. The outcome was written before she'd ever pressed the needle into that man's chest. Effective immediately, Hendricks said, "You are suspended pending investigation. Your credentials are being flagged with the State Nursing Board. Security will escort you to collect your personal items from your locker." She nodded once. Stood. The security guard opened the door. As she walked past Dr. Sterling, he leaned in slightly, just close enough that only she could hear him. "You should have stayed invisible," he whispered. "Some people aren't meant for the light." Danielle kept walking. The locker room was empty. Everyone was either sleeping or still working. She opened her assigned locker and removed the 3 things she'd brought to work that morning: her badge, her personal stethoscope, and her jacket. Before she hung the jacket in a locker, she fingered the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, threads worn soft from years of touch, the edges fraying, the colors long since faded to something that looked almost like grief. It was the only piece of her past she'd kept. The only thing that proved she'd ever been anyone at all. She shoved the jacket inside her bag. Security walked her to the parking lot. The rain had started at some point during the night. Not gentle rain. Real rain. The kind that came down like applause or judgment, depending on how you were listening. She stood in it for a moment before walking to her car, letting it soak her scrubs, her hair, her skin. The water mixed with something else. Something she wouldn't have allowed herself to call tears while anyone was watching. She got in the car. Drove home through the empty streets of Raleigh at 4:33 a.m., her hands at 10 and 2, her breathing controlled, her face perfectly composed. The invisibility she'd spent 3 weeks building, the careful construction of being unremarkable, unnoticed, unknown, all of it had collapsed the moment someone's lungs had filled with air instead of blood. Dr. Sterling sat in his corner office at 7:14 p.m. that evening, the sun already gone from the Raleigh skyline, and made the first of 12 phone calls that would methodically disassemble Danielle Ross's employment. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. Volume was for people without leverage. He had something better than volume, he had the infrastructure. The first call went to Dr. Marcus Webb, chief of the hospital board's credentialing committee. Sterling had funded Webb's daughter's medical school education 3 years ago, a $180,000 quiet arrangement that nobody discussed but everybody remembered. "Marcus, I need to discuss a serious liability concern," Sterling said, his voice smooth as oil on still water. "One of our nurses performed an advanced procedure tonight without authorization. Needle decompression. That's anesthesia-adjacent work. I'm concerned about scope creep, about our accreditation standing." Webb listened. Webb always listened. The second call went to Patricia Chen at the State Nursing Board, whom Sterling had donated $45,000 to her re-election campaign for the Licensing Commission. "Patricia, confidentially, I've had a nurse attempt procedures well outside her credentials. I'm obligated to report this to your office, but I wanted to give you context first. She may claim emergency circumstances, but protocol exists for a reason." The third call reached Danielle's previous employer in Baltimore, where she'd worked for 6 months before Raleigh. Sterling had a name there, someone who'd been mentioned in her sparse references. "I'm Dr. Harrison Sterling, Oak Creek Memorial. One of your former employees is on our nursing staff, and I'm conducting a background review. Did she ever exhibit erratic judgment? Boundary issues?" He let the questions hang like smoke. He didn't accuse. He implied. Implication was cleaner than accusation. By 8:11 p.m., Sterling had activated a network of 3 board members, each with their own reasons to take his concerns seriously. By 9:15 p.m., he'd contacted the state board with a preliminary incident report. By 10:33 p.m., he'd arranged for James Hartley, an outside hospital investigator with a perfect record of termination recommendations, to arrive at Oak Creek Memorial the following morning. Hartley was the kind of investigator who understood that investigations were narrative construction. You gathered facts, yes, but facts were clay, they could be shaped. A needle decompression performed by a floor nurse became an authorized emergency protocol deviation. A life saved became scope of practice violation. Danielle's lack of prior incident record became absence of documented infractions, which was different from clean record, which implied she'd hidden violations before. The investigation took 36 hours. Hartley interviewed Dr. Sterling privately, listened carefully to his concerns about institutional liability, and spoke briefly with 3 residents who'd been in the trauma bay. None of them wanted to contradict a senior physician. All of them confirmed that yes, Danielle had performed the decompression. Whether it was emergency protocol or violation depended entirely on how you framed the question. By 6:22 p.m. on the second day after the paratrooper's arrival, Danielle received a termination letter in a sealed envelope delivered by hospital security. The words were clinical, procedural, impeccable. Unauthorized procedures exceeding scope of nursing practice. Violation of state licensing standards. Immediate suspension pending final investigation review. She read it 3 times standing in the break room. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply folded the letter, placed it in her scrub pocket, and said nothing. "I'm sorry," said Marcus Webb, the same Marcus who'd called Sterling back to approve the termination within 30 minutes of his recommendation. Webb couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm really sorry." Danielle nodded and walked past him without speaking. Security escorted her from the building at 6:56 p.m., her locker already packed into a cardboard box in the guard's hands. Other nurses watched from the hallway. Some looked away. Some looked sympathetic but did nothing. One, a young girl named Cassie from night shift, started to say something, but Danielle shook her head slightly, and Cassie stayed quiet. The rain started as Danielle pulled out of the parking lot, heavy and cold, the kind of November rain that felt like punishment. She didn't go home. She drove through Raleigh with no destination, her hands at 10 and 2, her breathing controlled. The invisibility she'd spent 3 weeks building had collapsed in 48 hours. Everything Sterling had constructed with his phone calls and his favors and his narrative shaping had worked perfectly because nobody had known who they were dismantling. She'd chosen this hospital because it was small enough to be quiet but large enough that nobody asked questions. She'd chosen this city because nobody here knew her name or her rank or what she'd survived. She'd told nobody, not her sister in Charlotte, not the VA psychiatrist she'd seen twice before stopping, not the grief counselor she'd visited after Michael died, where she'd gone or what she was running from. At 8:15 p.m., Danielle drove to Oak Grove Cemetery on the eastern edge of Raleigh. The gates were technically closed at sunset, but she parked outside the fence and walked through the wet darkness, her boots silent on the sodden grass. She knew exactly where he was. She visited twice a year, on his birthday and on the anniversary of his death. Michael Ross. Captain, U.S. Army. Died 2019. 3 lines carved into granite that somehow had to hold the entirety of a marriage, a partnership forged in fire, a man who'd believed in second chances when Danielle had stopped believing in anything. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone, rain streaming down her face, and let the words come in a whisper that sounded like breaking. "I failed again," she said. "I couldn't stay invisible. I couldn't keep the promise I made when I walked away. I survived Baghdad and lost you anyway, and now I've lost everything we hoped I'd find here, a quiet life, a normal life, something without war." The rain fell harder, hammering the stone, the ground, the grass around his grave. She traced his name with her fingertips, water running between the carved letters like a river. Her jacket, the same one she'd worn every shift, held the faded unit patch sewn into its lining, the only piece of her past she'd kept. She'd refused promotion. She'd refused ceremonies. She'd refused the Navy's offer to help her transition into civilian work. She'd just run. "I should have known better," she whispered. "I should have known that people like Sterling exist everywhere. That no matter how quiet you are, someone will still come looking for a reason to break you. I was supposed to be gone, Michael. I was supposed to disappear completely and just be a nurse. Just be normal. Just be. Her voice cut off. In the distance, she heard something. The faint sound of an engine. Then another. Then the unmistakable percussion of helicopter rotors, distant but moving closer, the rhythm that lived permanently in her muscle memory, in her nervous system, in the part of her brain that never left Baghdad. She stayed pressed against his headstone, rain mixing with tears, and didn't move. Whatever that sound meant, she didn't have the strength to care anymore. She'd already lost everything she'd come here to find. The helicopter passed overhead, invisible in the dark, its rotors shaking the rain from the leaves above her, and she closed her eyes and let it pass over like thunder. 2 days. 48 hours. That was all it had taken to undo 3 weeks of careful invisibility, to watch Dr. Sterling activate his network like a man pulling strings on a marionette, to lose the one place that had felt safe since Michael died. She'd survived Baghdad. She'd survived his funeral. She'd survived 3 tours and her own mind and the screaming silence of PTSD that made even hospital alarms feel like incoming fire. She'd survived everything except the simple act of being overlooked. The rain fell on Oak Grove Cemetery as Danielle Ross knelt in the mud, her forehead pressed to her dead husband's name, and waited for whatever came next. The rain stopped. Danielle left the cemetery at dawn, her dress still wet, her hands moving through each shift at Oak Creek Memorial like a woman operating underwater. 2 days. That's all it took from suspension to complete erasure, security badge deactivated, payroll records flagged, rumors spreading that she'd violated every protocol in the book. The nurses she'd worked with for 3 weeks suddenly looked away when she passed, unsure if proximity to her contamination might spread. Dr. Sterling had done his work with precision. Board members who'd initially hesitated had been walked through his narrative with the finality of a diagnosis, procedural violations, unauthorized scope creep, a liability risk that couldn't be ignored. One of them had actually called the state licensing board. Sterling's network held. The system protected its own. Danielle was clearing her locker on the evening of day 3 when the orderlies wheeled in a patient for the night shift. She didn't look up. She wasn't staff anymore. She wasn't anything. The stretcher moved past her toward the ICU, and then the patient's hand reached out, trembling, urgent, reaching across the distance between them. Danielle's eyes lifted. The man had a distinctive scar running down the left side of his neck like a rope left too long in the sun. Baghdad. November 2009. A safe house in the Jolan district that wasn't safe anymore. Insurgent cell leader with a 9mm Beretta and 2 minutes before Air Force bombers painted the grid square. She'd tackled him through a window into an alley, applied direct pressure to a carotid bleed, gotten him breathing, gotten him extracted. They'd shipped him stateside as a detainee. She'd never seen him again. Senior Chief Ross. His accented English carried the precision of someone who'd spent years memorizing those 2 words. You saved my life. That day. That street. You saved me. His eyes locked onto hers with the weight of a classified file suddenly declassified. I am American now. Informant. Protected. Because you did not let me die. The locker door hung open in Danielle's hand. She didn't move. She didn't speak. The man was wheeled past her, his hand still reaching, still trying to hold the connection to the person who'd held him together when it mattered. Danielle stared at the empty space where he'd been, her jaw locked, her breathing the only sound in the hallway. 1 minute. 60 seconds. The walls of the hospital suddenly felt thinner. A voice came from the hallway entrance, military sharp, female, carrying the particular timbre of someone accustomed to command. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross. The paratrooper's daughter appeared in dress blues, Navy lieutenant, gold dolphins pinned over her heart, boots polished to a mirror finish. Her father had survived the tension pneumothorax in the emergency room, recovered fully in 18 days, and spent every hour since telling his family and his command the name of the woman who'd done the impossible. My father told us you saved his life. The commander told us why. You haven't gotten a thank you from the people who matter. That ends right now. Danielle's hand lowered. The locker door swung shut. Behind the lieutenant, the nurse supervisor appeared, older, grey-haired, moving with the gait of someone whose hands were shaking in a way she couldn't control. She held a manila folder, official seal visible even from 5 feet away. Classified. Red stripe. The kind of file that makes hospital administrators suddenly need to sit down. Danielle. The supervisor's voice cracked. She'd never called her by her first name before. I need you to hear this. From me. In front of a witness. She opened the folder and read aloud, and the hallway of Oak Creek Memorial became a place where shadows and light separated into clarity. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Elizabeth Ross. 12 years active service. 3 full deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Surgical field skills, advanced. Combat emergency medicine, expert level. Commendations, Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Citation for Valor Under Fire, December 2009, Anbar Province. And a Navy Cross. The Navy Cross for exceptional heroism, sustained heavy fire, saved the lives of 47 Iraqi security forces during the evacuation of forward operating base Shank. Each word came out like a bell tolling. You've been operating under a protection agreement since your honorable discharge. There's a note in your file, do not contact. Credible threats from hostile networks. Recommend continued civilian identity protocols. The folder trembled in the supervisor's hands. Danielle's face remained still. Her breathing didn't change. Inside her chest, something vast and ancient shifted, like continents realigning after a long stillness. A man in khaki and insignia appeared at the far end of the corridor, SEAL Team 3 command insignia, the kind of presence that made the fluorescent light seem dimmer by contrast. He walked toward her with the specific cadence of someone who'd crossed deserts and hostile borders and come back carrying knowledge that never quite leaves the body. Senior Chief Ross. I'm Commander Clayton. I led the task force that recommended your protection placement. I also received a briefing this morning from your former commanding officer, who wanted you to know something. He paused, and the hospital hallway seemed to hold its breath. Navy Cross. That's 1. Silver Star. That's 2. Bronze Star. That's 3. 2 Purple Hearts. That's 4 and 5. Your Navy Cross citation mentioned 47 lives saved under direct fire. Commander, that's what we call legacy-level heroism. Danielle's eyes closed. Just for a moment. Just long enough for the world to reorganize itself. An FBI liaison appeared from the stairwell, federal credentials, the bearing of someone who'd spent years protecting assets that couldn't protect themselves. Ms. Ross, I'm Special Agent Chen. You've been operating under protection protocols since 2012 because 3 separate hostile networks made credible threats against your life. 2 of those networks have been dismantled. The 3rd was neutralized 5 months ago. Your protection status is being downgraded as of today. The credible threat assessment is closed. The liaison handed her a new badge. Not hospital. Federal. You can exist in the light now, if you want to. The hospital doors swung open then, and the sound came first, boots on polished tile, synchronized, military perfect. Dozens of them. The lobby of Oak Creek Memorial flooded with bodies in dress uniform, and moving through them like a ship cutting through water came a 2-star admiral in full dress blues, the kind of presence that doesn't ask permission before entering a room. Cameras followed him, local news, tipped off hours before by the Paratrooper's family, ready to capture what they somehow already knew was about to matter. The Admiral found Dr. Sterling by the administrative office, where he was reviewing a chart, completely unaware that his world was being dismantled by federal machinery. Dr. Richard Sterling. The Admiral's voice carried the weight of authority accumulated across for decades. Not loud. Never loud. The kind of quiet that commands silence in return. You suspended a decorated Navy combat veteran for performing the exact life-saving procedure she was trained to execute. You publicly humiliated a service member suffering from combat-related PTSD. You attempted to destroy the career of a woman who holds a Navy Cross. You knew none of this when you did it. You did it anyway. Sterling's face drained of color. The chart fell from his hand. Cameras caught the moment perfectly, the precise second when institutional power evaporated. Your medical privileges at Oak Creek Memorial are revoked, effective immediately. The Admiral didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Your case is being referred to the State Licensing Board. Your medical license will be suspended for minimum 3 years pending investigation. Security will escort you from this building. You are no longer welcome here. 2 military police officers moved forward like a practiced choreography. Sterling tried to speak, but nothing came. His mouth opened and closed like a fish, and the Admiral simply turned away, a gesture more dismissive than any words could have been, and walked toward Danielle Ross. The lobby cameras panned with him. The entire hospital staff watched from their posts, understanding in that moment that they'd misread the situation completely, that the quiet nurse they'd dismissed was something else entirely. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross, I'm Rear Admiral Michael Graves, Naval Expeditionary Warfare Command. On behalf of the Department of Defense and the United States Navy, I want to apologize for allowing you to operate in isolation for this long. That was our failure. But that isolation is over. He saluted. Fist to chest. Hold. Release. Thank you for your service. Thank you for continuing to serve, even when we weren't watching. The cameras flashed. The lobby froze like a photograph. And Danielle Ross, for the first time in 12 years, allowed herself to be seen. 6 months dissolved like morning mist. Spring came to Washington, D.C., and the rose garden bloomed in colors so vivid they seemed impossible. Danielle stood in a simple navy dress, no medals, no insignia, nothing but the woman herself, while the President of the United States placed a civilian commendation around her neck. Photographers captured the moment. News outlets carried it across the country. The woman who'd carried invisibility like a second skin had become, overnight, a public symbol of the cost of service, the weight of secrecy, the particular bravery required to save lives in the dark and never speak about it. Her sister held her hand during the reception, crying in the way that sisters cry when they've spent years not understanding their own family member. The paratrooper stood at attention in his service dress blues, fully healed, a living witness to what one moment of expertise and courage could accomplish. A letter arrived from overseas, forwarded through 3 diplomatic channels, from the Iraqi security chief whose life Danielle had pulled from an alley in 2009, now a commander himself, serving his own people, never forgetting the American medic who'd treated him not as an enemy but as a human requiring care. During the reception, a Navy liaison in civilian dress found Danielle by the windows overlooking the garden. There's something you should know, the liaison said quietly. Richard Sterling. His medical license was suspended for 3 years. He's teaching CPR at a community college in Raleigh for $22,000 a year. No hospital will hire him. His colleagues won't return his calls. His network dissolved the moment the Admiral walked into that building. It turns out institutional power is only powerful as long as the institutions protect it. Danielle didn't respond. She didn't smile. She simply nodded and excused herself, moving through the reception until she found a quiet corridor in the East Wing. Her hand reached inside the neckline of her dress and found what she'd transferred there that morning, the faded unit patch from her jacket lining, worn nearly threadbare from 12 years of being carried like a secret. The insignia was barely visible anymore, but she could trace it with her fingers. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. The only piece of her past she'd kept because she thought burying everything else meant she could survive. She'd been wrong. She'd survived. And now the survival meant something different. It meant standing in the light. It meant a young combat medic finding her later that evening, nervous and shaking, asking if they could talk sometime about transitioning home. Danielle took her hand, scarred, capable, steady, and said the words that had been waiting 12 years to escape. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to keep showing up. Some wounds scar over into strength. And some of those scars, finally allowed into the light, become landmarks for others to navigate by. Like, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts. What would you have done in Danielle's position? And if you could send a message to any service member in your life, what would you want them to know? Let me know down below.